Awesome. And we're live, Dylan. So thanks for everyone who has joined this week's Ecom Weekly Live. We're going to be diving into office hours. So we've done this episode a few times before, and mostly the main things we're going to touch on today really are diving through at Aplo Group over the past couple of weeks. Some of the most asked questions and heavily discussed topics with our client base of high growth 7 and 8 figure D2C brands. So Dylan's joining me here, who leads what we do at Apple on the service side and oversees a lot of how we manage clients and our strategies that we develop, and works directly on client accounts. So a lot of good stuff that he'll walk through today. And the goal really is just to go through these most discussed topics and give you insight into kind of our opinion, why brands are asking it, and so on and so forth. So Dylan and I, both founding partners at Aplo Group and co-founders of Allen. So brief intro into those two pieces before we dive into the content, so you know who's chatting here today. So Aplo Group is our growth marketing firm. We specifically work with direct-to-consumer based businesses. We've worked with over 150 brands historically. They typically range anywhere from 5 to 100 million in annual revenue across food and beverage and CPG, clothing and apparel, supplements, pet supplies, pet supplements, etc. So a lot of different verticals that we'll kind of talk about today. And on the Allen front, that is a tool that we've developed internally at Aplo. It is a one-to-one email personalization tool that brands can use to increase the revenue per recipient and send personalized emails to all the recipients on their list directly through Klaviyo. So check that out. If you're a brand running email, which if you are a brand in the D2C space, I hope you're running email. And with that being said, we'll dive in. Again, agenda is quite simple. Most asked questions and topics that we've been discussing with our clients over the past couple of weeks, and then we'll go into a brief Q&A period for those that are registered for the webinar. For those that are watching this on YouTube, we will cut the recording at that point. And the Q&A is just reserved for those that have registered. So if you are watching on YouTube, please make sure to register for future episodes so we can do live Q&A together. And with that being said, we'll jump right in. So Dylan, the first question that we put together here based off of what's been kind of a hot topic over the past couple of weeks. And I'd say this has been a topic that's been a hot topic for many, many months in the past better part of a year or so. But how do you balance AI creative versus high production creative? So I'll hand it off to you, Dylan, to kick it off, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way in which you balance it is actually by going to the two extremes. So I think
Yeah.
a lot of the stuff in the middle is basically going to become like a waste of resource. You essentially want to play the volume game with like the cheapest, highest output volume of creative on one side. And then on the other side, you want to probably get more into very creative storytelling, and it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be like high production value, but maybe like high human effort might be the right way of putting it. Like across ad accounts, we typically see like a lot of like basic ads do well that can be AI generated, and we also see a lot of like really well thought out, planned video content with really thorough briefs that also get made by a person, not an AI avatar. So
Yeah.
I think we're going to kind of see more of the two extremes. I think as like if you're in-house at a brand or an agency or what have you, the value probably goes more and more to the higher quality stuff over time, as like the lower quality stuff, or not the lower quality, but like the easier to produce stuff probably becomes more and more commodified. So I think that you win the game by playing both ways, and you don't try to like settle in the middle.
Yeah, I think it's a good take, and it also reminds me we're actually earlier today on a call with a creative agency, and just kind of chatting through what they focus on, just from a kind of meeting what they do, what they focus on, and they're really sticking to the route of just like focusing on high effort, high creative focused human led production of creative, and really bringing the value from that perspective. Whereas some firms are focused on, again, just high output of as many assets as you possibly can. I think. I agree with what you're saying. Basically, the two extremes, in the middle is kind of where things go to die. What do you think of, and I think this is something that's come up quite a few times across the client base, more so on the AI permutations of winning creative and really kind of pouring gas on the fire. I know, Dylan, you've commented before that if you're not playing that game, you're kind of almost shooting yourself in the foot by not taking advantage of how many different creatives and variations you can make of winners to give meta basically as many at bats as possible. So what are your thoughts on that? Curious if that's come up the past couple of weeks and kind of your take there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's diminishing returns on too many variations of stuff that, it's like an incremental change that may or may not actually like do much. But I think that when there is limited permutations in an account or versions, I think now it's easier than ever to spin up more. So I, I think that like if you're not using AI in your creative workflow, you're probably missing out on the
100%.
volume side. And then the high production side, I think, is where I think because AI is like cool and it's awesome. I think that it's actually just raised the bar on what has to be done if you want to have differentiation.
Mhm.
And as long as you're following and using some of the newer tools, I think most of the value then accrues to the higher production, more well thought out creative.
100%. Awesome. We'll move on to the next one, which is when should I expand into new channels? This is kind of a question that is always present in every brand owner's mind, I believe. So curious what's been talked about here, Dylan, over the past couple of weeks as well.
Yeah, it's really hard to give like one size fits all advice here, but I would say over time you generally want to sell where your customer is, and in many cases they are everywhere. But there are certain categories that can get away with staying D2C only the longest. So I'll give some best rules of thumb. And most brands we work with are D2C first, not always, but I'll speak to this question as if you're a D2C first brand. Um, Typically, if you have limited lifetime value and you're scaling from 7 into the 8 figures, often this is kind of like, somewhere between like a couple million bucks a year and 50 million bucks a year, depending on the brand, is when they start thinking about adding new channels. And if you're in that space and you don't have high lifetime value, it's probably important that you go and get into wholesale faster, because that effectively becomes your recurring revenue. It
100%.
doesn't mean
Yeah.
it's necessarily going to change your business and help you triple or quadruple. Sometimes it might, but it at least might give you some solid base that you can expect from a revenue standpoint and in turn contribution margin. If you are a high LTV brand, you can often get away with staying D2C or D2C and Amazon only longer, just because you normally have higher stability due to return customer revenues. Eventually, it probably makes sense to sell anywhere, like in more places, regardless. But when you're in that situation, you want to think about the following. Um, how much room left do you have on CAC? Like, because as you scale spend, generally CAC does go up. And if you're kind of plotting out your expectation for when CAC starts getting to an unmanageable rate, you have to make sure you either have new products or new channels or new markets that can satisfy the growth from that point into the future. And oftentimes, it doesn't have to be channels, but many times channels can be a new avenue to add to try to get more revenue, especially if you're in a grocery aisle. In that category at scale, so much of that category gets purchased in grocery. So that often makes sense there. So those are some like general best practices, I'd say.
Yeah, and then I guess like to build on that. So obviously we're kind of coming to the end of June. May and June is usually a pretty slow time of year for many brands in the D2C space, and then you obviously get into essentially the depths of Q3 before you hit Q4, which is a big time for most brands in the D2C world. So what's been kind of the discussion and I guess thought process as well on your end around when to test new channels if you are planning to do that during the calendar year, especially kind of where we're at right now as we kind of go into, again, a slower period of time, then things build up before Q4. Obviously, you don't always want to test something brand new in the heat of Q4. So I'm curious what people have been asking on that front, if anything, and kind of your take there as well.
Um, I mean, like if you're trying to like have a big Q4, like I guess as soon as possible is probably like when you decide that that is the most important thing in your business, doing it as soon as possible probably is good. Obviously, like if you
Agreed.
launch something in January right after quarter four, um, like that's on my maybe that's unfortunate if you had a good if you were a good Q4 brand, like you probably should have planned better and launched
Missed
it
out a bit.
sooner.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I don't really think the time matters that much. I think there's like instances where you might want to slow down, like for example, when you roll out in wholesale, if you don't have a good strategy for doing that, it could actually set you back if you don't do it the right way with the right team. So like it's not just rush for the sake of rushing, but like if it's the most important thing in your business and you also have the right team in place, it probably makes sense to move as fast as possible, regardless of the time of year. There's probably some exceptions if you sell super seasonal stuff that's not always going to be stocked, but like in most cases, the timing I don't think matters all that much.
Cool. Awesome. All right, we'll jump into the third one. So, what is the optimal growth rate I should shoot for? Something that we actually discuss a lot at Aplo with the brands that we work with. Obviously, we have a pretty heavy involvement on the modeling and forecasting side, which really helps us be involved in this discussion with the brands that we work with. And in many cases, when we're talking to a new brand, we're really identifying, okay, what is the maximum and what is the optimal growth rate for the business based off their goals, based off the economics of it. So this is obviously very contextual, but probably a good way to go through this, I'm assuming, Dylan, on your end also, is just kind of based off how you kind of talk through this with the brands when they bring this up and when this discussion kind of arises. Obviously, something we also have as we kick things off with new businesses very frequently too in the kind of initial phase. But yeah, curious how this conversation goes and how you typically approach it on a brand-to-brand basis.
Yeah. So the optimal growth rate is basically the maximum growth rate you can maintain safely without hitting a fundamental constraint that prevents you from going further faster. So I'll give you the most obvious example: selling durable consumer products. If you buy product and it takes you 3 months to get it, you can only sell as much as you buy. That is essentially like one limiting factor. Now, there's also limiting factors where, depending on how much profit you earn from selling the goods you buy, you then only have so much additional dollars to buy more inventory in excess of what you purchased previously. So, for most consumer businesses,
Mhm.
the growth rate is capped as a function of what one can afford to buy. Now, this is an example where, and let's say that caps you at, I don't know, 100% year-over-year growth, which would be still a super high growth rate
Yeah, I would.
for most brands. But let's just
I'd
say
sign up.
that's,
I'd
let's just
sign
say
up for that.
yeah, let's just say that's the cap. Um, like that is the constraint is inventory. Okay. Well, you could then go and say, well, I'm going to try to get a negative cash conversion cycle, meaning you sell the inventory largely before you have to pay for it.
Mhm.
And if that occurs, inventory is no longer the constraint. What's the next constraint? Well, if it's not inventory, it may be your risk tolerance for how you're actually purchasing inventory. Because in the event that you sell slower than expected and the payment comes due, based off of your balance sheet, what are you actually comfortable betting on in terms of purchase order sizing? So,
Mhm.
like in theory, if you were selling like a digital good with no incremental cost of selling an additional user, well, theoretically, as long as CAC to LTV makes sense and cash flow looks good, you just go. But selling durable products, it all kind of gets built around inventory as what sets the bar for what is
Yeah.
possible. And like downstream of that, what we often most talk about is like how fast do your cohorts compound on a CAC to LTV basis? What does that mean in terms of contribution margin over time, net margin over time? But once we basically identify that a funnel's investable and we're happy with the ROI and things are growing, it's not really that often is the limiting factor most of the time. It's usually how much stock there is.
Totally. And I guess one other thing to pick your brain on with this is, how do you see most brand owners and operators approaching this question or topic when you kind of first initially discuss it with them? Like where are they typically coming at it from? Obviously, we have some, of course, that we met that we know, like, you're spot on. You know the game. But I'm curious, kind of your take as well on, like, where do people typically come from when they look at this question, and how do they typically arrive at what they believe is the optimal growth rate?
It's usually arbitrary, I would say.
Mhm.
And like that's not necessarily a problem. Like
Yeah, yeah.
it's good to have goals. But then you have to work backwards from there as to how do you achieve that goal. So like the way I would think about it is as follows. When you do a forecast, when we build forecasts for brands, we're trying to tell a brand what we believe is most likely to occur, based off of the data that is true today. And let's say we're forecasting 20 million bucks of revenue on the year, and the goal is 25. Well, then it's a conversation of what would need to be true to make 25 viable. It doesn't mean that that goal, maybe if it was set arbitrarily, is fundamentally a bad goal. It's just then a conversation of, okay, like, well, in theory, if you get sub and save take rate to be this, or
Yeah, yeah.
if
You
you can
start
get
pulling. Yeah.
AOV to be this, like how can you start stacking the odds in your favor so that you can actually fulfill that $25 million goal? But if the goal is like 35 million, you might look and say, well, there's no logical low-hanging fruit thing that we think is a high probability of success in hitting this goal. So every other variable to hit that goal is probably like new product, which has high probability of failure, but it's almost like a VC bet where it's like some small percentage of product launches will have huge upside. And it's like at that point, you don't have to necessarily throw your goal of 35 million out the window, but you can at least say, like, with what is true today, it's unlikely to occur, but I'm going to
Mhm.
do my best with these other things to make
Yeah.
it happen.
Yeah.
It's all just probabilities. And
Yeah.
I'm all for setting big goals. I think big goals are important, but I think it's important to also set what is most likely to occur with what is true is today, because that conversation helps kind of govern the conversation around risk management when growing, specifically around inventory planning and how aggressive you want to be with either reinvesting profits or using debt.
Yeah, it's really good framing, and I also think that's part of the value too that a good agency or a good growth firm such as ourselves, I'll say, really brings to the table. I think in these conversations as well.
I
I think
agree.
that's exactly shameless plug there, but no, but truthfully, I think again that's a lot of the types of conversations we have, and it's for that reason. I think being realistic is obviously, of course, always the way to go. So, at what point should I bring on a fractional CFO? Um, Take it away.
Uh, yeah. So I think so before I give best practices, it's always important to also keep in mind that when you're building a team, you should build a team based off of your skill sets. Like former CFOs are probably not the most common career path to start a consumer brand, but we have had some finance forward founders we've worked with who
Yeah.
like can kind of put this off for a while because they kind of can do this themselves quite well.
Mhm.
But that's not the average or the most common thing we see.
I would say
So
on that point that like at least also my take speaking with a lot of brands during kind of the auditing, pitching phase, et cetera. Like you have a lot of people in D2C that are kind of very much product people, which is fantastic, but they come into this space, they make some sort of product, they have an idea for something. They know that D2C is basically the, very low barrier to entry to actually start selling online and trying to push it online. And something sticks and it starts going and they're like, oh wow, look at this is fantastic. But I find a big percentage of the people that at least I speak with too, are very much product people, which again is fantastic and absolutely needed. But that also again changes the dynamics of when an actual fractional CFO might make sense. Again, to your point, based off of what your core competency is as a founder, as a founding team, as a team, et cetera. But not to jump in there, but just wanted to throw that one in.
yeah, I think that's totally the case. And then I think the other variable here is basically if you're getting to a place where your net margin is good, but your cash flow is bad, and you're doing at least a couple million bucks per year, that might be a scenario where it makes sense to bring someone
Mhm.
on, more likely closer to 10 million. And then the other one is like anytime you're using debt,
Yeah,
especially if you haven't used much debt before in your life
yeah,
to build and grow businesses,
yeah. That's a good point.
you really want to make sure you're doing that with the proper
You want guidance.
guidance. Yeah.
It's worth the money you're going to pay for somebody to guide you properly on that if you don't have the
Think
confidence and conviction of it.
think of it
100%.
as like inexperience insurance.
Yeah,
Like it's obviously
100%.
not technically that, but it's like
Yeah,
if you're gonna borrow $1 million, like depending on how you do that, you just want to make sure that you're not making a really bad decision.
yeah.
Because we've seen yeah, we've seen it. We like
Tons of times.
debt is an amplifier. So if you're about to do really well, it may have to lead even better. But if you're like, I don't know, might kind of start slowing down a bit, you can
Yeah.
actually just make the situation far more worse.
100%. Yeah, 100% agreed there. So, last question we have, and so at Apple, we work with a lot of subscription-heavy businesses. So I think this is a great one to dive into. So, should I give my subscription customers more to stay subscribed and reduce churn? So, basically, how much should we give to keep people on board and subscribed? Obviously, again, contextual to the business. But Dylan, you're on the ground floor with a lot of subscription brands at Apple. So curious what your discussions have been here.
Yeah. So you generally want your subscription customers to have the best deal, meaning like you don't want to be a brand that has like a 10% off subscription for like benefit, but then like every other week you're giving 20% off to try to get more sales to like chase revenue. So there are exceptions to some of the stuff I'm about to say. But in most cases, the game of subscription is you want to give more on the front end to increase subscription take rates. and then you want to give less on the back end to increase lifetime contribution margin or gross margin blended. Because most subscription businesses realize more value from their customers after order one than on order one. In fact,
Totally.
in most cases, it's like way more.
Yeah.
So, or at least in many cases. So you basically are then incentivized to try to get more people on subscription. What's often the easiest way to do that? Increase the difference in price for one-time purchase versus subscribe and save.
Mhm.
And then after that, you want to, have a lower discount amount. So this is almost the opposite of that. Is like sometimes like one of the reactions, one of the ideas that we've frequently seen come up is like, oh, like a lot of people churn on my subscription. So what if I offer less on the first subscription but more on the other subscriptions?
Yeah, it's like
And
a
it's like,
slow death. Yeah.
and it's like you'll probably improve churn. Yeah, I agree. But if you actually look at the blended average value of a customer, that goes down. So you're optimizing for the wrong metric in that case
100%.
most of the time.
Yeah, and I think what's like there's so many subscription based or like subscription dominant businesses where if you look at the LTV cohorts and break it apart between like on first order has subscribed versus one time purchase, or like the value of a subscriber in most cases over the course of the year is 2, 3, 4, 5 times more than a one time purchaser on order one. So we've had some really great success with a few brands on the subscription side simply by really focusing on that take rate on order number one and being on subscription. I know that's something that we pushed very heavily too. So urge anybody that's running a subscription brand to really focus on that. If you're not monitoring what percentage of your order or your first orders are on subscribe and save and constantly trying to make that better, there's probably a pocket to really focus on within the business to actually have some outsized returns. And usually that's going to be one of the biggest levers you can actually pull if that's the game you're playing too. So totally agree with that. That is basically it before we dive into Q&A. So we're going to stop the recording for those watching on YouTube. For those that are registered, we're going to keep going and do live Q&A. So Dylan, appreciate the time. We'll jump into Q&A. Thanks for everybody that's tuning in live right now. We'll jump into Q&A, and those watching on YouTube, make sure you register for the future episodes that we do. But awesome. We'll jump into it.